Have you ever wondered, like, why religions, these powerful forces throughout history sometimes seem to kind of lose their way? It's fascinating, right? Like, they get so big and influential that they almost forget what made them meaningful in the first place.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today in our deep dive into the decline of religions.
Okay.
Our main source is this academic study, and it's actually called The Decline of Religions. Very straightforward.
Makes sense.
And it looks at how, like, rigid institutions and power struggles, and even just like an overemphasis on rituals,
Oh, interesting.
can overshadow the true essence of faith.
Yeah, you can see how all of those things would contribute.
Right. And what's really cool is that the study focuses specifically on Christianity and Islam and draws these fascinating parallels between their journeys.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah, and to add like another layer to our exploration today, we're also going to be looking at insights from a 19th century text called the Kitáb-i-Íqán. And this text offers a very unique perspective on this whole issue of religious decline.
So we're going to kind of see how these two different sources interact with each other.
Exactly.
Very cool.
All right, so let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
So the study starts by talking about how this decline isn't like a sudden collapse.
Right.
It's more of like a gradual shift over time, almost like in stages.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, where the initial spirit and intention of the faith kind of slowly become obscured.
Okay, so almost like a process of change over time.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so let's unpack this first stage,
Okay.
which this study very helpfully labels institutionalization.
Okay, so we're talking about institutions here.
Yeah, and to kind of make this relatable, think of it like a small startup that grows into like a massive corporation.
I see.
Right? In their early days, both Christianity and Islam were all about those close-knit communities and a direct connection to the teachings.
Right, very personal, very individual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as these faiths grew, they needed more structure.
Oh, of course, to manage everything.
Yeah, so in Christianity, this led to the rise of the papacy,
Right.
like this centralized authority figure.
kind of like the ultimate decision maker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in Islam, you have the emergence of the caliphate, which is a similar system of leadership.
Okay, so both faiths developed these hierarchical structures.
Yes. And with this increased structure, though, came a shift in focus.
Interesting. So how did the focus change?
Well, it became less about that personal faith, that direct connection,
Yeah.
and more about who's in charge, who holds the power.
So you're saying that as these religions became more organized, they also became more focused on power and authority?
Yeah, that's exactly what the study is suggesting.
That makes a lot of sense, when you think about it.
It's that classic shift, right? From individual heartfelt belief to a more organized and potentially power-driven system.
Right. And that shift, as we can imagine, sets the stage for some complications down the road.
Yeah, for sure. We'll definitely get into that.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so moving on to the second stage that the study talks about.
Okay.
This is what they call earthly control.
Earthly control. Interesting.
Yeah, and this is where things start to get a little messy between those spiritual aspirations and those worldly ambitions.
Okay, that tension we were just talking about.
Exactly. So, for instance, the study delves into the Crusades.
Oh, wow.
These series of religious wars launched by the Catholic Church.
Okay, so major historical event.
Major historical event. And they're often portrayed as being motivated solely by religious zeal.
Right, like a pure desire to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity.
Yeah. But the study suggests a bit of a more complex picture.
Oh, really? So there's more to it?
Yeah, where political and economic motivations were also very much in play.
So it wasn't just about religion?
It seems not.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so it really makes you wonder, to what extent was the religious aspect being used to justify other goals like expanding power and influence?
Yeah, was it a convenient kind of cover?
That's a good question. And the study suggests that in some cases it might have been.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about territorial expansion either. The church also amassed significant wealth through the Crusades.
Oh, wow. So they gained both land and money.
Exactly. And that further solidified their worldly power.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Right. And the study gives this really interesting example of the Venetian Republic.
Okay.
They provided ships for the Fourth Crusade. And they negotiated this deal that gave them control over a huge portion of the conquered territories.
Wow, so they were in it for the economic gain.
It seems that way.
So again, it's not just about religion, it's about power and wealth.
Exactly, and this highlights how spiritual ideals can get distorted
Right.
when earthly ambitions start to take over.
It's almost like a slippery slope.
Yeah, like once you start down that path, it can be hard to turn back.
And the study also mentions the Inquisition.
Oh, yes!
Which is a very dark chapter in church history.
Yeah. It certainly is. I mean, the Inquisition was basically a series of institutions that the church established to root out heresy.
Heresy, so anyone who dared to challenge their teachings.
Exactly. And the methods they used were, let's just say, brutal.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about torture and violence.
Yeah, they used all sorts of tactics to enforce conformity and suppress any kind of dissent.
And that's so at odds with the message of love and compassion that's supposed to be central to Christianity.
Right, it's hard to reconcile those actions with the teachings of Jesus.
Absolutely. And the impact of the Inquisition was devastating. I mean, it created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust and really damaged the church's reputation.
It really did. And it shows how when an institution becomes so fixated on controlling people's minds, on enforcing this rigid dogma, it can resort to these horrific measures.
It's a cautionary tale for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So we've seen some pretty clear examples of how things went wrong within Christianity.
Right.
But what about on the Islamic side?
Yeah, you mentioned that the study also looked at Islam.
It did, and it brings up the Ottoman Empire as a case study.
Okay, so how does the Ottoman Empire fit into all of this?
Well, initially it was this flourishing empire, known for its cultural richness and its rapid expansion. And its rulers were considered these protectors of the Islamic faith.
Right, so far so good.
But over time, the emphasis seemed to shift.
Okay, in what way?
It became more about maintaining that vast empire and consolidating political power, sometimes at the expense of spiritual development.
So again, that tension between worldly power and spiritual goals.
Exactly. It's like the burden of managing this huge empire started to overshadow those religious ideals that initially guided it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to keep that balance.
Right. And the study points out that even today, some Islamic states face criticism for using religion as a means of control.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like restricting individual freedoms in the name of religious law.
So that tension between faith and worldly power is still playing out.
It seems to be a recurring theme throughout history.
Yeah, regardless of the specific religion, it seems like there's always this temptation to use faith for political gain.
Yeah, and that struggle seems to be constant.
It's definitely something to think about.
All right, so we've talked about these potential pitfalls within both Christianity and Islam.
Right, these tendencies towards institutionalization, earthly control.
Yeah.
And even kind of losing sight of the true spirit of the faith.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that within both of these religions, there have always been individuals and movements pushing back against these trends.
Oh, right. So it's not like everyone just went along with it.
Exactly. There were always people trying to bring the focus back to that core spiritual essence.
Okay. So kind of like reformers or dissenters within the faith.
Exactly. And the study emphasizes that those voices are crucial to remember.
Right, because they show that there's always hope for renewal.
Yeah, they remind us that even within a system that's become distorted or corrupted, there's always that potential for change.
Right, that potential for people to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right.
Yeah, and that the human spirit's desire for authenticity and meaning can never be fully extinguished.
I love that that's a really hopeful thought.
It is. All right, so now let's bring in that 19th century perspective we mentioned earlier.
Oh, yes, the Kitáb-i-Íqán.
Exactly. And this text offers a really fascinating lens on these patterns of religious decline.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about this.
Yeah, so it's almost like Bahá'u'lláh, the author, is looking at this whole historical trajectory of these major faiths. The institutionalization, the thirst for power, the empty rituals.
Right.
And he's basically saying, wait a minute, this isn't what religion is supposed to be about.
So he's calling out the hypocrisy?
In a way, yes, but he's not just criticizing the problems.
Okay.
He's offering a solution, a path for reconnecting with the true purpose of religion.
So what does that path look like?
Well, one of the central themes he emphasizes is the separation of religious and political authority.
Okay, so kind of keeping those two realms distinct.
Exactly. He argues that figures like Jesus were focused on spiritual transformation, not on establishing earthly kingdoms.
Interesting. So he's drawing a clear line there.
Yeah, and he critiques how religious institutions, whether churches or mosques, can become more concerned with controlling people's minds than with actually liberating them to seek truth and meaning.
Okay, so he's advocating for individual freedom of thought and belief.
Yes, and he introduces this concept of progressive revelation.
Progressive revelation? What's that?
So he's suggesting that God reveals truth gradually over time, adapting to humanity's evolving capacity to understand it.
That's a really interesting idea.
It is, and it actually connects back to what we were talking about earlier.
How so?
About how institutions can become so focused on control
Right.
that they lose sight of their original spiritual purpose.
Okay, yeah, I see the connection.
And the Kitáb-i-Íqán also encourages us to question blind faith.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, to independently investigate truth and to use reason alongside our faith.
Okay, so it's not about just blindly accepting what we're told.
Exactly. It's about using our own minds to discern what's true.
That's a powerful message.
It is, and it's a message that I think is really relevant today.
Yeah, I agree. So where do we go from here?
Well, now that we've laid this foundation, let's delve into some specific historical examples.
Okay.
To see how these stages of decline actually played out.
Sounds good.
Yeah, we'll look at how these concepts manifest in real-world events.
So we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details.
Exactly, and that'll give us more concrete understanding of this complex interplay of factors that can contribute to the decline of religions.
I'm ready when you are.
Let's do it.
Okay. All right, so we've outlined these stages of decline, the institutionalization, the earthly control, and the rise of superstition. But let's delve into some tangible historical examples to actually see how these concepts played out.
I like it. Let's get specific.
Exactly.
So we're just talking about the Crusades.
Right.
And those seem like a pretty clear illustration of religion being used for purposes that weren't exactly holy.
Yeah, I mean, the Crusades were initiated by the Catholic Church, right?
Right.
And framed as this sacred mission to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. But a closer examination reveals a more complex picture.
Yeah, it sounds like the religious aspect was at least partly used to justify expanding power and influence.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about territorial expansion either.
Oh, really?
The church also amassed significant wealth through the Crusades.
Wow.
Which further consolidated their worldly power.
So they were really benefiting on multiple levels.
Yeah, and the study gives this example of the Venetian Republic.
Okay.
They provided ships for the Fourth Crusade, and they negotiated a deal that gave them control over a large portion of the conquered territories.
Oh, wow. So it was very strategic.
Yeah, it highlights how spiritual ideals can be distorted when those earthly ambitions take center stage.
Right. It's like they use the religious cause to achieve these other goals.
Exactly. And the study also mentions the Inquisition.
Ah, yes, the
It's a
Inquisition.
very dark chapter in church history.
It's tough to even talk about, but I guess it's important to acknowledge these things.
Yeah, I mean, the Inquisition was essentially a series of institutions established by the church to root out heresy.
So anyone who disagreed with their teachings
Anyone who dared to challenge the church's doctrine.
and the methods they employed were pretty brutal.
To put it mildly, yeah.
Violence, intimidation, torture.
Yeah, they used all of these tactics to enforce conformity and suppress dissent.
It's really hard to reconcile those actions with the teachings of love and compassion that we associate with Christianity.
Yeah, the hypocrisy is pretty stark.
It is, and the impact of the Inquisition was devastating.
It created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust,
Ah.
and severely damaged the church's reputation.
Right, it's like they became the very thing they were supposed to be fighting against.
Yeah, and it exemplifies how when an institution becomes fixated on controlling minds, enforcing rigid dogma, it can resort to these horrific measures.
Scary thought.
So we've seen some pretty clear examples of how things went astray within Christianity.
Okay.
What about on the Islamic side?
Yeah, the study mentioned the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, the Ottoman Empire provides another compelling case study. Initially, it was this flourishing empire, right? Renowned for its cultural richness and rapid expansion. And its rulers were regarded as these protectors of the Islamic faith.
Okay.
However, over time, the emphasis seemed to shift
In what way?
more towards maintaining that vast empire
Uh-huh.
and consolidating political power,
Right.
sometimes at the expense of spiritual development.
So again, that tension between worldly power and spiritual goals.
Yeah, it's like that burden of managing this huge empire started to overshadow those religious ideals that initially guided it.
It's like they got caught up in the game of power.
Exactly. And the study also points out that even today,
really?
some Islamic states face criticism for using religion as a means of control, restricting individual freedoms in the name of religious law.
So that issue's still very much alive.
Yeah, it's this ongoing tension between faith and worldly power.
It seems to be a recurring theme throughout history.
It does, doesn't it? Regardless of the specific religion.
Yeah.
It seems like there's always this temptation to use faith for political gain.
And it's hard to resist that temptation once you have power.
For sure. So we've talked about these potential pitfalls within both Christianity and Islam, right? These tendencies towards institutionalization, earthly control, and kind of losing sight of the true spirit of the faith.
But it's important to remember that within both of these religions, there have always been individuals and movements pushing back against these trends.
Right. It's not like everyone just passively accepted these things.
Exactly. There were always people trying to bring the focus back to that core spiritual essence.
But like reformers or dissenters within the faith.
Yeah, and the study emphasizes that those voices are crucial to remember.
Because they show that there's always hope for renewal.
Yeah, they remind us that even within a system that's become distorted or corrupted, there's always that potential for change.
That potential for people to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right.
And that the human spirit's desire for authenticity and meaning can never be fully extinguished.
That's a beautiful thought.
It is. All right, so now let's bring in that 19th century perspective we mentioned earlier.
Oh, yes, the Kitáb-i-Íqán.
By Bahá'u'lláh. And this text offers a really fascinating lens on these patterns of religious decline.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about this.
So it's almost like Bahá'u'lláh is analyzing this whole historical trajectory of these major faiths, right? The institutionalization, the thirst for power, the empty rituals.
Right, all the things we've been talking about.
And he's basically saying, wait a minute, this is not what religion is meant to be.
So he's calling out the hypocrisy and offering an alternative.
Yeah, in essence, yes. But he's not just criticizing the problems.
Okay.
He's also offering a solution, a path for reconnecting with the true purpose of religion.
So what does that path look like?
Well, one of the central themes he emphasizes is the separation of religious and political authority.
Okay, so kind of keeping those two realms distinct.
Exactly. He argues that figures like Jesus were focused on spiritual transformation, not on establishing earthly kingdoms.
So he's drawing a clear line there.
Yeah, and he critiques how religious institutions, whether churches or mosques, can become more concerned with controlling people's minds than with actually liberating them to seek truth and meaning.
So he's advocating for individual freedom of thought and belief.
Yes, and he introduces this concept of progressive revelation.
Progressive revelation? What's that?
It's the idea that God reveals truth gradually over time, adapting to humanity's evolving capacity to understand it.
That's a really interesting idea.
It is, and it connects back to what we were talking about earlier about how institutions can become so focused on control that they lose sight of their original spiritual purpose.
Well, yeah, I see the connection.
And the Kitáb-i-Íqán also encourages us to question blind faith.
To think for ourselves.
Yeah, to independently investigate truth and to use reason alongside our faith.
So it's not about just blindly accepting what we're told.
Exactly. It's about using our own minds to discern what's true.
That's a powerful message.
It is. All right, so we've explored these historical examples, these cautionary tales, if you will.
Yeah.
But now let's circle back to the Kitáb-i-Íqán.
Okay.
How does it fit into all of this?
Well, the Kitáb-i-Íqán offers a really insightful perspective on these patterns of religious decline.
Yeah.
It's almost as if Baha'u'lláh is looking at the historical trajectory of these major faiths. The institutionalization, the thirst for power, the empty rituals, and proclaiming this is not what religion is meant to be.
So he's calling out the hypocrisy and urging a return to genuine faith.
In essence, yes. But he's not simply criticizing the problems. He's also offering a solution.
Okay.
A path for reconnecting with the true purpose of religion.
So what does that path look like?
Well, one of the central themes he emphasizes is the separation of religious and political authority.
Okay.
He contends that figures like Jesus were focused on spiritual transformation, not on establishing earthly kingdoms.
So he's advocating for that classic principle of rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's.
Precisely, Baha'u'lláh argues that religion should be about purifying the heart and cultivating virtues.
Okay.
Not about accumulating worldly power or imposing rigid doctrines. He critiques how religious institutions can become more concerned with controlling people's minds than with liberating them to seek truth and meaning for themselves.
Which, as we've seen, can lead to some very detrimental outcomes.
Indeed. But Baha'u'lláh also presents a hopeful vision.
That's good.
He asserts that every religion at its core possesses the power to uplift humanity, to foster unity and justice, and to guide individuals towards spiritual enlightenment.
That's a beautiful thought.
He introduces the concept of the unity of religion.
The unity of religions.
Yeah, suggesting that all the major faiths are essentially expressions of the same divine truth, revealed progressively over time to meet humanity's evolving needs.
So it's not about abandoning religion altogether,
No.
but about rediscovering its original purpose.
Exactly.
That essential spiritual core that transcends dogma and power struggles.
Precisely. He reminds us that the true measure of a religion lies not in its worldly influence or its ability to control people, but in its capacity to transform hearts and inspire acts of love, compassion, and service to others.
That's a powerful message.
And this perspective leads us to a crucial question.
Okay.
If these patterns of decline can occur within such vast and established religions,
Right.
how can we ensure that our own personal beliefs and spiritual journeys don't fall into those same traps?
That's a thought-provoking question, and it's one we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll examine the psychological and sociological impacts of this decline of religions, and what it all means for us as individuals seeking meaning and connection in the complex world we live in today. Stick with us, because understanding these dynamics can offer valuable insights into how we can navigate our own paths of faith and meaning-making. So we've covered a lot in this deep dive, exploring the decline of religions.
Yeah, we've really gone in depth.
We've looked at how those institutions can become so rigid, and how that pursuit of power can corrupt, and how focusing too much on rituals can sometimes overshadow the real heart of spirituality.
Right, we've seen how those patterns play out again and again.
But now I want to shift our focus a little bit to the bigger picture. Like, what are those ripple effects that kind of extend beyond just the walls of those religious institutions?
So we're talking about the psychological and sociological impacts.
Exactly. Like, when a religion loses its way, it's not just the institution itself that suffers.
Right. The consequences can be felt by individuals and by society as a whole.
Yeah. So let's start with that individual level.
Yeah. Right.
Like, how does this decline actually impact people's personal faith and their search for meaning?
Well, I think one of the most significant impacts is this profound sense of disillusionment.
Disillusionment.
Yeah, because when people see hypocrisy, corruption, abuse of power within a religious institution, it can really shake their faith to its core.
It's kind of like that trust is broken.
Exactly, and they might start to question everything they've been taught.
Right, like your whole worldview is challenged.
Yeah, leading to a real crisis of faith.
It's almost like experiencing a betrayal.
It is, like you said, that trust is broken, and it can lead to feelings of anger, resentment, even a sense of abandonment.
That makes sense.
And beyond those emotional responses, there's also the potential for trauma. We talked about the horrors of the Inquisition.
Right.
But even in less extreme cases, the pressure to conform, the fear of being ostracized for questioning beliefs, can have a lasting impact on a person's well-being.
Yeah, it creates this atmosphere where it's not safe to really explore your spirituality.
Exactly. You're constantly worried about being judged or rejected.
So it's not just about intellectual disagreement. It can really affect people on a deep emotional level.
Absolutely.
And I imagine that experiencing that kind of disillusionment or even trauma within a religious context can make it so much harder for people to find meaning and purpose in their lives.
It can, because when religion becomes more about control and dogma than about genuine spiritual seeking, it can stifle personal growth and the search for truth.
It's like it closes you off rather than opening you up.
Exactly. And it can also hinder authentic connections with others because there's this underlying fear of judgment or rejection.
Yeah, you're always walking on eggshells.
Right. So you never really know if you can truly be yourself.
So we see how this decline can lead to disillusionment trauma, a sense of lost meaning on a personal level.
Right.
But how does this play out on a larger scale? Like, what are the societal implications?
One of the most concerning consequences is the fragmentation of communities.
Fragmentation.
When a religion becomes entangled in power struggles and rigid doctrines, it can create divisions and sectarianism.
Right, like different groups within the religion start to fight amongst themselves.
Exactly. They're competing for dominance, and it creates conflict and animosity.
It's almost like a family feud, but on a much grander scale.
Yeah, and this fragmentation can have really detrimental effects on social cohesion.
Okay.
It erodes trust, makes it difficult to cooperate on important issues, and can even fuel violence and persecution.
Yeah, sadly, we see that happening in various parts of the world even today.
It's a reminder that religion, while often seen as a source of unity and moral guidance, can also become a tool for division and conflict, especially when it strays from its spiritual core.
Just that double-edged sword.
Exactly. And beyond this fragmentation, there's also the erosion of moral and ethical values.
Interesting.
When a religious institution becomes preoccupied with worldly power and wealth, it can compromise on its core principles.
Right. It's like those in power start to justify their actions, even if they go against the teachings of the faith.
Exactly. And we see this in instances of corruption, abuse of power, and the justification of violence and oppression, all in the name of religion.
It seems like power, even within a religious context, can be really corrupting.
It can, and when a religious institution loses its moral authority, it also loses its ability to guide people towards a more ethical way of being.
Right, it's like that compass is broken.
And that can create a climate of cynicism and distrust, lead people to question the validity of any moral or ethical system.
Yeah, it's like a downward spiral.
So we're talking about some pretty serious consequences here.
We're both for individuals and for society as a whole.
But it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay, go.
Well, I was hoping you'd say that.
The Kitáb-i-Íqán offers a more hopeful perspective.
Yeah, how so?
Baha'u'llah's message is ultimately one of hope and renewal.
Okay.
He reminds us that the true purpose of religion is to uplift humanity, to promote unity and justice, and to foster our connection with the divine. So it's about getting back to those core values.
Exactly. And he emphasizes the importance of independent investigation of truth.
Right, thinking for ourselves.
Encouraging us to question blind faith and to use our reason to discern what is truly beneficial for ourselves and for the world around us.
So it's not about rejecting religion altogether.
No.
But about recognizing its potential pitfalls, learning from those mistakes of the past, and finding ways to reconnect with the heart of faith.
Exactly. It's about rediscovering those universal values that transcend dogma and division.
Right, those values that unite us rather than divide us.
And that's a journey that each of us can undertake, regardless of our religious background or beliefs.
Yeah, it's about personal responsibility.
It's about cultivating our own inner compass, developing our own understanding of truth and goodness, and striving to live in alignment with those values.
And it's about recognizing that the decline of religions isn't an inevitable endpoint. It's a call to action, a challenge to return to the true essence of faith, and to create a world where religion can actually be a force for good.
I love that.
That's a powerful thought to end on. And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the decline of religions. We hope this exploration has provided you with some valuable insights and perhaps even a renewed sense of hope. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep striving to make the world a better place.